Thank you. I want to welcome everybody here to the Attorney General's office and acknowledge Colonel Borzakowski and Colonel Manny, who are here with me as well as members of their command staffs. We're here to announce that the Providence County Grand Jury this morning reported that no criminal charges are warranted in connection with the investigation of matters arising from the incident at the Wyatt Detention Center on August 14th, 2019. Because this was a grand jury investigation under the current state of Rhode Island law, there is relatively little that I can say with respect to what occurred before the grand jury in terms of the substance of the testimony presented, or the grand jury's deliberations, or the reasoning behind their decision. In fact, prosecutors are not present for a grand jury's deliberations, nor does the grand jury share its reasoning with prosecutors. I think it's worth describing, particularly in this case, how the grand jury process works in general. The grand jury consists of 23 people selected at random by the court from Rhode Island's population. In Providence County, they sit for 6 weeks at a time, every day of the week. It is the role of this office as attorneys to advise the grand jury of the applicable law as it pertains to the relevant factual situation, and to present witnesses and other forms of evidence, such as documents or electronic evidence. At the conclusion of the evidentiary presentation, the prosecutors, and this is our critical role, a role that we own, instruct the grand jurors on the applicable law. In other words, we define for the grand jurors the elements of the crimes that the grand jurors are considering. Once those instructions have been given, the prosecutors leave the grand jury room, and the grand jurors vote to decide whether there is probable cause based on the evidence that they have seen or heard that a crime or crimes have been committed. Turning to this investigation, the investigation conducted by the prosecutors of this office and the Rhode Island State Police, assisted by the Central Falls Police Department, was extremely thorough. Over 70 witnesses were interviewed by prosecutors and/or detectives. Approximately 75 pieces of video footage were obtained and analyzed. Medical records were sought in connection with anyone who alleged injury as a result of the incident in question. The grand jury heard testimony and saw evidence in this case over many, many days. As I have said previously, we asked the grand jury to investigate and consider evidence pertaining to the entirety of the incident at the Wyatt that occurred on August 14th, which they did. However, we did not ask the grand jury to consider charges against the protesters, and here's why. It is true that some protesters peacefully, and I want to emphasize, peacefully, blocked an access point to the Wyatt Detention Center. It is also true that they could have been arrested for that conduct. In fact, it may be that some expected to be arrested for that conduct. Nevertheless, law enforcement, in its discretion, an exercise of discretion with which I take no issue, chose not to arrest them for that conduct. Accordingly, I did not and I do not believe that the conduct of those protesters, in terms of whether charges should be brought, was an appropriate matter for the grand jury to consider. And so we did not instruct them to consider that issue. I chose to bring this case to the grand jury because I believe that given the breadth of conduct here, the large number of people involved, and the potential need to use compulsory process to gain evidence in this case, the use of the grand jury would ensure the most thorough investigation of this matter. The grand jury worked really hard to sort through all the testimony and evidence that was presented to them. From my own experience, I am sure that they had to deal with complicated legal and factual issues, including critically determining the intent of those whose conduct was within the scope of their investigation, and whether that intent rose to the level of criminal misconduct. Often, these are not easy issues for grand jurors or trial jurors to grapple with. I met with the grand jurors this morning, and I am grateful to them for their public service. As I said a few months ago, a peaceful protest, a right enshrined in our Constitution, devolved into an extremely unfortunate incident because of several unfortunate decisions. I want to be clear, none of those unfortunate decisions were made by protesters. Had the decisions been made differently, I believe that this matter could have been avoided. There is much to learn from this incident, and it is my hope that we will do so. And so with that, I'll take questions if you have any. Steve?
Do you think the decision makes it easier now for police, correctional officers, and private guards to now assault people with impunity?
Yeah, I don't think so, Steve. I understand your question. I think what's critical here for me is that we learn from this experience. And the lesson for me here is this, that we need to have a sufficient law enforcement presence when there is a protest to protect public safety. That is the lesson here from where I stand. I can't speak for anyone else. I believe that after this incident, that lesson was learned and that subsequent protests were peaceful. And so I would not say that. And I will say this, I would not hesitate, again, to carefully and thoroughly investigate anyone who tried to harm anyone who was peacefully protesting, whether that be a private citizen or whether that be a member of law enforcement.
One of the protesters that you met with this morning said that you told her, protesters didn't do anything wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So her, on hearing the news today, she said, well, if we didn't do anything wrong, why were we subject to violence? How would you answer that?
You know, Ed, I think when and I agree with the statement. Let me just confirm two things. Number one, that I did meet with the protesters this morning, and I did that because I wanted them to hear from me first. Look, I recognize the disappointment here. I understand how they feel, and it is not lost on me the pain that they are in. And so I thought that they needed to hear from me directly and in person the result of this grand jury once we were able to make it public, and the grand jury reported out this morning. I think getting to the second part of your question, or maybe it's the entire part of your question, the criminal justice system is not a perfect instrument. Sometimes it's a blunt instrument and it's not a scalpel. There can be conduct which objectively is wrong, but yet doesn't rise to the level of criminal misconduct. And I'm not talking about my own view of this conduct here. That's not what's appropriate for me to comment on. The grand jury made that decision. But again, I've been doing this a long time. I've been in grand juries. I've asked questions. And there are times, I think, when grand jurors make a distinction, or trial jurors make a distinction between misconduct and criminal misconduct. And I think that's an important distinction to keep in mind. But the criminal justice system sometimes can be a blunt instrument, not a sharp one.
One of the protesters this morning told me that there's a two-tiered justice system for police and for people.
Yeah.
And that if there was a non-correctional officer driving that truck, the charges would have been brought easily by your office, not even going to a grand jury.
Yeah, Steve, it pains me to hear that, but I understand it. I've been doing this for a long time. When I was U.S. attorney, that certainly came up around the country in the context of police shootings. I can only say this, that I don't treat anyone differently under the law. I don't believe that anyone standing behind me does that either. Ultimately, it's my responsibility to make these kinds of decisions. Over the course of my career, and I've been doing this for a long time, in the federal system, we take every case to the grand jury, every single case to the grand jury. We don't have that luxury here because of the volume. But I do believe that in cases that are complicated, where there's lots of evidence to obtain, where there's evidence that you may want to obtain that you may need a subpoena to get, that a grand jury is a useful tool. It's a useful opportunity to put witnesses in front of 23 of their peers who evaluate all of the conduct. That's our system. That's our trial system. So I don't think the grand jury is a tool to be diminished. I think it's a tool to be embraced. That said, it is what it is, and I understand the disappointment of people with this result. I do, and frankly, that's why I wanted to meet with them. It was not lost on me that when I walked into that room this morning that what I was going to hear was a lot of pain and anger. But it's important for me to hear that, and I welcome that conversation, and I would do it again.
How do you respond to the criticism you probably heard this morning from some of the protesters saying that the prosecutors were focused on asking questions about the conduct of the protesters more so than the corrections officer?
Yeah, Ed, the prosecutors knew my feelings about the conduct of the protesters before they walked into the grand jury room. We were not evaluating the conduct of the protesters for the reasons I've articulated. Look, when I've been in grand juries, as I said myself, many times, I've been in grand juries with one of these prosecutors and maybe the other one. You ask tough questions in grand juries. You are trying to get for the grand jurors what is relevant and what is true. And it has been my experience that sometimes, and it's understandable. It's understandable because we do this all the time. But there are instances when I think witnesses may read into the questions things that may not be there. I will tell you this, that this case was a priority for me. I assigned my best people to it. I've worked with them for a long time. I worked for them for a long time. Stephen, there's no prosecutor in this state that I have more confidence in particular, than Stephen Danbrook. He has tried and worked some of the most critical trials in the history of the state, if you do your homework. There's no one in whom I have more confidence. That's not to say that I don't understand the comments that you're referring to. I understand that that is part of the pain that these protesters feel. That said, I am confident in the mechanism that we used, and I am confident in the people that I assigned to this matter. And I will say this: this was not something. Only the prosecutors, by the way, are in the grand jury room. So to that extent, it's us and the witnesses and the grand jurors. It's not the detectives. But I will say, and I don't want to leave this out of my remarks, that the detectives here did an outstanding job. An outstanding job. You know, I reviewed their report. It is extensive. It is outstanding work.
Unlike a trial jury, a grand jury doesn't operate in a bubble. The likelihood they know that the central figure in this, the correctional officer at the center of this, was cashiered or resigned from the Wyatt. How much of a role do you suppose that played in the outcome?
You know, Steve, I don't know. Grand jurors don't share their deliberations with us. We don't know what the vote was. It doesn't have to be unanimous. It's 12 jurors need a vote of the 23 to return a true bill, is what the phrase is, a charge. So I don't know if that played into it at all. I don't know that, frankly, I don't know if they even heard that evidence. I mean, we do instruct them to consider the evidence before them and nothing else. So, as I said, these were experienced prosecutors who I believe did a fine job and did the absolute best they could with the evidence that they had. And look, our critical role in the grand jury is to put the evidence before the grand jurors, and this is critical, to give them the legal advice that they need to analyze that evidence, to give them the law that would apply to the facts we're talking about, and we work very hard to try to get that right.
Which statutes were you giving them? What crimes did you say they could charge?
Yeah, I can't get into that specifically, but I will tell you this, that when we go into the grand jury, it is my practice, it is our practice, to give the grand jurors the entire universe of potential charges that we think could be returned reasonably. We don't present a case to a grand juror that we don't think that if the grand jury indicted, that the result would be unreasonable. That doesn't mean the grand jury may vote or not vote one particular way, but I would not take a case to a grand jury where I thought a charge of any kind would be unreasonable, nor would I present to them a charge that I thought if they did indict on that charge would be unreasonable, nor would I present to them conduct that I didn't think they should consider fairly under the law, and that was a decision I made with respect to the conduct of the protesters.
Protesters I spoke with this morning, they expressed deep disappointment in the decision, as they've reiterated many times, and they also expressed that they no longer trust law enforcement as a result of this decision. I want to know if you feel this affects the integrity of law enforcement, and I want Colonels Barzakowski and Manny to respond.
Yeah, so look, that is not a new feeling. That's something that we in law enforcement know exists out there. I've been aware of it when I was in federal service, and I think one of the reasons why I place such an emphasis on getting out into the community is to try to overcome that lack of trust. I think that's a real problem for us in law enforcement. It's not an easy issue to solve, and I understand how today doesn't help in that regard. But I'm committed to trying to make that trust happen. But I understand today's a difficult day in that regard, and I'll leave the colonels if they wish to address that question. Colonel Manny, if you wish.
Sure. And if they could, if you additionally say, does this lend any additional scrutiny on your part or Colonel Barzakowski's part toward what goes on at the Wyatt?
Good afternoon. I'll try and answer both those questions. I'd like to give you a timeline first before I answer either question. So on July 2nd, the Rhode Island State Police was advised there would be a protest at the Wyatt Detention Center. We were advised by the Central Falls Police Department. And the request was that if they needed assistance, it appeared that it was going to be a peaceful protest. If they needed assistance, if we could have extra troopers in the area, which we did. There was no incidents at that time on July 2nd. On August 14th, Rhode Island State Police received a similar call from the Central Falls Police Department that there was going to be a protest at the Wyatt Detention Center and that they would follow the same protocol they did on July 2nd with some added security, which I'll let the chief go over. And once again, the request was to have extra troopers on a perimeter in the event there was an incident. State Police sent 4 uniformed troopers and a non-commissioned officer, a sergeant, to that area, and that was the date of the incident that we're talking about today, but the State Police did not go in. It was over by the time we got there. So the Attorney General brought up a very valid point that moving forward, we reevaluated our plan at the Wyatt Detention Center, that even though there are calls that it would be a peaceful protest, and that in the past it had been, that we now send troopers directly there to meet with the Central Falls Police Department and to be actively involved in those protests and the future protests that did occur. So, and there were 2 others. Subsequently, there were 2 other protests. It's September 13th and September 16th, and the Rhode Island State Police took a more active involvement to keep the peace at the Wyatt Detention Center. I also have to reiterate, our detectives worked very hard on this, and this will answer your question, sir. They took 55 statements over a 10-week period. They put in over 500 hours of work. I'm sorry that this group feels that way, but that's simply not the case. We're there to protect them and to protect everyone, to keep the peace, and we do the best we can, and we will move forward and continue that mission. I did meet personally with this same group last week in my role as the superintendent with the governor to work out any mistrust, any hard feelings, anything, and that was never brought to my attention at that meeting. So I hope I answered your question. Steve, I hope I answered yours as well.
The police when the truck went through the crowd, the police were not in the immediate area. They were way up both streets.
The state police were not in the immediate area. That's correct.
So there was no police presence at the time when the truck went through, or when the guards came out with pepper spray either. That was maybe 5 minutes later.
Right. I did state that. The Rhode Island State Police were not present at that time at that location.
So there were no police at that.
I'll let the chief answer that part of it.
Colonel Barth, if you would step to the podium. So were Central Falls Police there when the truck went into the protesters? And then what are you changing about your policies in the department to better address this issue?
So the first part of that, Central Falls Police were there throughout the evening. Now, understand too that we had 400 protesters down there initially, a group that actually started in Jenks Park and walked down to the Wyatt Detention Facility. So basically, we had multiple areas of concern. We had to make sure of public safety. Obviously, we had a plan in place. We communicated with state police, communicated with surrounding communities. In our experience dealing with this group, having less presence down there at the time seemed to keep them a little bit calmer. So our officers basically, between being at the Wyatt, maintaining security down there, and also secure the people that were walking back to their vehicles. So it was multiple areas they were responsible for. Going forward, they were circling the perimeter of the area. I had 2 officers assigned there specifically to circle the perimeter of the area, constantly having contact with them and the people walking back to their vehicles. Second part of your question, going forward, though, obviously, like I said, concern like that is hindsight's 20/20. You know, we couldn't foresee the actions of an individual that night doing that. And obviously now, anytime there's an incident down there, we're working with our partners in law enforcement and to ensure there's constant presence down there for incidents.
Feel, Chief, that it was okay for the correctional officers to unleash pepper spray on the crowd on a public street?
I think there has to be a exact divide there where their authority ends basically staying inside the facility and ours is outside the facility. We've had 4 different incidents dealing with these individuals. In the first incident, we found it necessary for public safety to make 18 arrests and no force was used. So I think we have to look at making some policy where anytime dealing with these individuals outside, it'll be by police law enforcement.
These individuals, are you talking about the Never Again group?
This individual or anyone else that chooses to protest there or anywhere else in our city.
So you feel it was inappropriate to use pepper spray in the public, on a public street against protesters?
I'm saying if my officers were in that situation, no force would have been used. We made 18 arrests. We made 18 arrests in an incident before that, and 0 force used.
Your officers made 18 arrests.
Correct.
In protest prior to.
Correct.
Protesting. Over what time period is that?
That was early August. There was back in that incident.
So just to be sure, what's the lesson for the Central Falls Police Department, and what's the lesson for the Wyatt officers that you're taking away from this? Should your officers have been closer to the scene when the incident occurred?
We've had more personnel down there. We've relied on our law enforcement partners, surrounding communities, state police, Lincoln, Cumberland, Pawtucket, all working together. Unfortunately, like incidents of this magnitude with this many people there, you don't know how they're going to end up. You know, you anticipate everything being peaceful, but we have to plan for, you know, all outcomes. So a little more planning in there, a little more staff at those incidents has basically provided better public safety, and that's what we're committed to. That being said, I just want to thank the public of Central Falls, the residents there, the community for their support in our actions and for their belief in us in the community. Unfortunately, not everyone's going to have that exact belief, but we work very hard to maintain the public trust in our community, and we'll continue doing that, working with our other agencies.
Colonel, were you aware of any incidents inside the facility that day, perhaps medical emergencies or violent incidents inside the jail?
Nothing was communicated about incidents inside, sir.
Are you otherwise notified of these kinds of, I mean, obviously if there's a rescue, you would know. But
Traditionally, incidents inside, unless it's a high magnitude, we won't be notified. Things outside, obviously, we have constant communication. And I had constant communication that evening with my shift commander.
One of the most consistent questions that has come from the public all across the political spectrum is, why was there no arrest made that night? Many people have commented that a civilian doing that same exact thing would have been arrested on the spot. So what was the justification?
I think the Attorney General did a thorough job answering that. I mean, we don't rush to judgment. In this incident, with the amount of people there, the amount of information we had to gather, the amount of statements needed to be taken, we didn't want to rush to judgment. So we wanted the investigation to be thorough, complete, and that's why we worked in conjunction with the state police and the Attorney Generals to ensure that happened. If we rushed to judgment and tried to do the investigation that night without all the assistance, you said 500 hours. How do we cram that into 4? We can't. So we needed the assistance of these other agencies working together to make sure when the charges come forward and presented, it was a thorough package. And I think, again, the AG, the Attorney General, basically reiterated that he believes it was thorough.
I think we have just time for one or two more
Just to
questions.
be clear on what you're saying about the authority, should the officers have stayed in Wyatt, or should they have not come out to handle this situation?
It's my belief, being in charge of public safety for Central Falls, they're trained to handle incidents outside, and my office is more professionally trained to handle incidents outside, so I'd like them to be separated.
You said outside
That
court,
to
how
the
is that
Wyatt, have you communicated to the Wyatt staff that that's a policy you'd like to have going forward?
I believe that's communication we're going to have to have going forward, absolutely.
You have not. So have you changed your protocols? I think I heard you say that you have made some changes to the approach, what goes on there.
Absolutely. We've increased our staffing there and our levels of security. Absolutely, we have.
Attorney General,
Just
I
one
would
more
like
question,
your
please.
opinion on whether you believe as a prosecutor that criminal conduct took place.
Yeah, and so, I think you can probably understand why I am reluctant to say that. We entrust our system to 23 grand jurors the way we entrust a trial jury to 12 jurors. In my career, as 20 years of doing this, I've never once criticized a jury, and I've never once criticized a grand jury, and I won't do it. I don't think it's appropriate, and I won't do it. I know what our mission is. We try to accomplish it. We do the best we can, and I think that we did that here. To your question, why not arrest right away? So had we arrested right away, the case would have ended up in exactly the same place. The person would have been arrested, bail would have been set, would have been brought to this office, and we would have put it into the grand jury. So there may have been a moment of, and looking back on it, maybe that moment from someone's point of view would have had meaning, and I don't mean to dismiss that, but for the legal process, it would have worked out exactly the same way. An arrest is made, it is presented to this office to decide how to proceed. We would have proceeded exactly the same way. So I hope that answers that question.
This morning, did you apologize to the people that you spoke to about the outcome of this case?
I didn't apologize to them about the outcome, but I did share with them that that I felt it was very unfortunate, and I felt that we in law enforcement have to do a better job collectively, to ensure that when people are protesting peacefully, and that is exactly what happened here, that they are safe. They are safe. Now, the decisions that were made are not ours alone. There are others, and they're obvious, right? But it is incumbent on us in law enforcement, myself included, to make sure that peaceful protesters are safe. And to me, what that means is having a law enforcement presence which is significant enough and substantial enough to ensure that. Hindsight, as the Colonel pointed out, is 20/20, right? So I'm not putting shade on anybody here. But I think we have all learned lessons from this matter. And going forward, I hope to have better results. I hope we don't get to that situation, Steve, that you alluded to in the beginning. I hope I never have to come back here in a case like this. And I shared that with the protesters as well. I think all of us wish that this incident had never occurred. It's extraordinarily unfortunate. You know, we applied the legal process. We are where we are, and we move forward. But I want to reiterate that I understand the pain and the strong feelings that the protesters have. I understand it. That's why I met with them. I wanted to hear it. I knew I'd hear it. I wanted to hear it. I own it. I should hear it. Anything else?
You mentioned the expectations now from law enforcement. Are there going to be any expectations you have for those correctional officers going forward and how they handle these situations?
Look, I don't. I think that if we are in a situation where we are prepared, and we have been. I mean, I want to commend both Colonel Manny and Colonel as well for being ready for the next time. And I'm confident that will be the case going forward. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you.